It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Look out, everybody. We've got ourselves an all-out Attack of the Crab Monsters. A name like that is awesome, of course, but it also just sounds like a movie people would say is one made by low-budget monster movie master himself, Roger Corman. And as it turns out, it is one of the many Roger Corman directed films from his time before he retired from directing to exclusively produce films. Attack of the Crab Monsters was one of his 8 films he directed, produced, and released in 1957 alone. Now just let that sink in for a moment. He released an average of 2 movies per quarter in 1957. Attack of the Crab Monsters was released on February 10th, 1957 with his Not of This Earth. Those were the second and third films released in the year, as Naked Paradise was released just 1 month earlier in January. Now, while I don't think anyone would say that Corman would make movies that looked like they cost massive amounts of money, he did have that knack of being 1, very efficient with money, 2, very efficient with resources, and 3, very efficient with time. He knew how to get usable takes quickly and without constantly needing to do reshoots or retakes. He was best known for finishing a shoot and realizing he still had location sets, actors, and film stock enough to go ahead and start shooting another movie with the remaining time he had. What came from that were definitely some stinkers, but in other instances, they proved to be at least somewhat watchable, if not actually quite interesting. And it also gave people like Jack Nicholson early in his career a chance to get a little experience in directing films. But still, 8 films in 1957, and not all of them were horror or monster films. Not of This Earth and Attack of the Crab Monsters were both science fiction films at heart, with some added horror, since the two genres were often closely linked back then. But then you had The Undead, which was the only pure horror film he made that year. Naked Paradise was a drama. Carnival Rock was a teen musical film. Rock All Night, Teenage Doll, and Sorority Girl were crime or noir films. So he did get around other genres. And of course, by the 60s, he would produce the biker exploitation films, and in the 70s, he'd be best known for producing what I would affectionately call sexploitation films. Maybe not quite on the level of Russ Meyer, but certainly movies that were usually comedies that had something to do with young people basically getting it on. Now, he also tended to work with a lot of the same actors. In this film, Corman cast Russell Johnson 2 years out from his supporting role in This Island Earth. Johnson, of course, is best known for being the professor on Gilligan's Island. And in 1957, Johnson went from Crab Monster to Rock All Night. The lead in this film went to Richard Garland, who was mostly a character actor, but also in 1957, Garland appeared in Corman's The Undead. Leslie Bradley was probably the actor that Corman worked with the most, who appears in this movie. Bradley appeared in Crab Monsters, Naked Paradise, and then Teenage Caveman in 1958. Even the writer of this movie, Charles B. Griffith, is a huge contributor on Corman films, having written several scripts for the director, and then even wrote scripts for later films that Corman produced, like Death Race 2000. Perhaps one of the more interesting people in the movie is actress Pamela Duncan. Now, Duncan would also appear in The Undead that same year. However, Duncan would, later in life, be featured in an Oscar-nominated documentary short from 2000 called Curtain Call. That was a movie that was about 8 residents of the Actors Fund retirement home in New Jersey. The featured retired actors all talk about their lives at the home, but also tell stories about being an actor at a period of the golden age of Hollywood. Now, sadly, Duncan died of a stroke just 5 years later at the age of 80 at the home. Despite not appearing in too many movies, she still amassed over 100 credits from the several TV shows that she appeared on in a 20-year career that spanned from 1950 to 1970. But the movie opens with kind of an apocalyptic passage from what I have to assume is the Old Testament, because it's all about God saying that he will wipe out man with the things he's created on earth. So jeepers, this movie isn't just a giant crab monster movie, but it's got some religious doomsday stuff baked into it too. But anyway, a team of people arrive on an island in the Pacific Ocean looking for a missing expedition team that has kind of disappeared with no word or trace. One of the men transporting supplies on a raft falls into the water and sees a giant crab on the floor of the ocean. And when they pull the guy back onto the raft, the guy has lost his head, literally. The lead of the naval crew just kind of sighs and tells the men to cover the body, and he plans to unload and return to his ship despite the incoming storm so that he can kind of get back to the regular naval business that he really kind of does on his day-to-day. Now, the sounds of what seems to be explosions are heard off in the distance. However, when the island begins to shake, it turns out to be a rock slide. It would also seem this island is rather treacherous no matter what you're here to do. That even includes an incoming seaplane that was arriving to pick up some of the people who were transporting material, just suddenly exploding for what appears to be no reason. What they are here to study is the fallout from the Bikini Atoll nuclear tests. Some are here to study the radiation, some are botanists, some are biologists. Now, the scientists begin to read the previous team's journal, and we learn that the lead scientist from the previous team found a large piece of flesh that resembles that of the common earthworm. However, it's not something that can easily be cut into or dissected. But based on what he found, it would be something near 5 feet in length. The scientists want to kind of pass this off as a discovery, and just kind of is like, let's get to work. But technician Hank Chapman, played by Russell Johnson, is rather concerned about this possible giant worm that could come and eat them. Now, the scientists continue working out the details of the journal and the debate over what it was that the previous team found, but they hear a peculiar crackling sound. They go outside to investigate, but are confident that it's just the wind knocking a metal wire against their hut. Now, sea biologist Martha Hunter goes for a swim and says she used a big black rock on the bottom of the sea to basically mark her bearings. However, when she turned around, the rock was gone. Now, geologist Jim Carson said that he did see something move under her, but after they reached landfall, others on the team showed Jim and Martha a large pit that suddenly formed that morning, sometime in between when Martha walked to take a swim and when she and Jim came out of the water. And that night, both Martha and Jim hear the disembodied voice of the head of the previous expedition. And Carson investigates the pit, thinking that maybe he's down there. But an earthquake causes him to lose his footing and fall. And then he says he's broken his leg. Others from the expedition plan to use the caves to retrieve him. And it would appear that the leader of this team, Dr. Vigan, is harboring a secret, but that's never really actually resolved for certain. While a group go to retrieve Jim Carson from the pit, Martha and Dale, played by Richard Garland, hear something messing with the hut. And when Dale investigates, he sees a large portion of the hut being destroyed by a giant creature. With daylight, another attempt to find Carson begins, but another earthquake strikes and a rock falls and severs a scientist's hand. The two naval seamen who were part of the demolition team on the island with the science team say that half of the island has fallen into the sea, and that night they are attacked by a large creature making the loud crackling sounds. And that night the seamen call out to the scientist who lost his hand to say they found Dr. Carson, and they lure him to the pit where they promise to lead him to Carson, and when he calls out to the seamen, he's attacked by a giant claw. So get this, everything going on here is due to the giant crabs. They are destroying the island by tunneling under the surface, but they are also killing the previous science team and the current team that's there now. And when a giant crab kills someone, it's able to use that person's voice and memories to communicate to others and lure them to their deaths. And that's what the crab tries to do with some of the men. By sheer dumb luck, despite grenades, bullets, and dynamite being unable to kill the crabs directly, they are able to kill one of the crabs by having an explosion collapse rocks onto the crab's brain bits. However, they surmise if they remove the rocks lodged in it, then the crab will come back to life. It's almost like removing a steak from a dead vampire's heart. And upon studying the pictures of the crabs in the caves, Martha says that the second crab, a female, is carrying fertilized eggs. Now, Hank learns that the reason why the crabs are frightened of electricity is because when electricity is applied to a sample that they took from one of the bodies, it disintegrates almost instantly. The scientists then say that that must mean the crabs are negatively charged. So Hank and Martha plant a couple of devices in the caves to basically shock the crabs as they lure the crabs out of the caves, almost like it's going to be triggered by motion and movement. But eventually only Dale, Martha, and Hank are the only three remaining survivors. The giant female crab threatens to consume them and then take her eggs to the mainland, where she will consume everything basically and assimilate the knowledge of all the people that the family of crabs will eat. Now Hank, because he's played by Russell Johnson, and this is just what he did in these 50s monster movies, sacrifices himself by bringing down a charged broadcast tower onto the crab to electrocute her and her unborn babies. Dale and Martha embrace on the very small part of the island that still exists, but I also don't think that they have any way to call for help. And there's kind of a darkness to this ending of this movie, but Corman ran out of money, so he couldn't explore that any further. Anyway, let's get to the three things I like about Attack of the Crab Monsters. First, I love that this movie is only barely longer than a pretty tight hour. It comes in at 63 minutes, and that means that this movie has zero time for fat or additional plot lines or stories that get in the way of giant radioactive mutant crabs. People arrive, they are left clues about what's going on, and they are attacked by giant crabs. And if you ask me, that's one of the great things about these B-movie monster flicks of the 50s. They get right to the point and hardly look back. Knowing Corman's ability to be incredibly efficient, it only makes sense that he'd be efficient with the runtime too. Second, I love that the movie is one of those closed-minded types of science fiction movies. Now let me explain. Several of the scientists are reading the journals from direct eyewitness studies about giant worm flesh, etc., and all end up saying, well, that doesn't mean that he found a large earthworm. It just means he might have found a large worm-like creature. Now, I understand the scientific process. Until you can observe something exactly, you can't say anything is factual, but you should be able to say that at least, yeah, there's probably a giant worm here, so let's be cool and watch out for it. Just because the guy who made the first observation of this giant worm isn't currently present, that doesn't mean that you start all the way over. I mean, I just found that the scene of the scientist going through the diary and coming to the conclusion that, the esteemed scientist didn't know what he was looking at, or at best, they weren't going to believe what the last guy said until they saw it too, kind of cracked me up. Now, thirdly, this movie's monster is utterly wild and unlike anything else I could have possibly expected or imagined. Giant crabs mutated by radiation from nuclear tests, sure, that all makes sense to me. I've seen the Godzilla movies. However, the concept that the monster crabs cannot just consume the missing scientists and seamen, but they also absorb their consciousness? Are you kidding me? That's insane. They even have a name for the monster, Hular. This is more than just a giant monster movie. This is a totally different spin on these types of monsters. They talk about how the crabs have these different genetic makeups with basically different ways for their atoms to independently act on their own. Which is, the atoms are independent of each other. So Dr. Vigan posits that the concept that whatever the crabs consume, they must assimilate it wholesale. That's how they can speak with the voices and knowledge and memories of their victims. The crabs even use the dynamite brought to the island by the demolition team to make their caves. That's brilliant. Admittedly, this is the first time I ever saw this movie. I had a completely different idea of how the crab monsters would be, like they would show up and just attack the scientists or whatever, or how they interacted with the movie itself. I had zero expectation that they would be able to assimilate their victims in this way. I mean, that even supersedes the awesome giant puppets that were used for the crab monsters. This is one of the most unique monster movies I've ever seen. And maybe that's the brilliance of Roger Corman, just making movies that are just interesting in this way. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and the Monster Monday show at your favorite podcast providers. And we also upload that stuff to YouTube, so you can subscribe to us there. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, it's Christmas, so I think it's as good a time as any to talk about the Tim Burton-produced holiday-spanning monster film, The Nightmare Before Christmas. So until next week, stay spooky.